I'll get it.
I looked for more of these and couldn't find them.
Oh, they're in the old freezer in the refrigerator.
Oh,
That's where we decided to keep snack things.
mm.
All right. Well, we'll see if some others join us. If not, they can watch the tape, as they say. So the agenda for this evening is to continue in our conversation. We're going to focus in on kind of the Reconstruction era, the era that follows the Civil War, and kind of just as we get into the turn of the 20th century. And then I think at that point in time, we will have sort of laid the foundation of what is the church's relationship to our society. The trends that we will have seen from the beginning, as we talked about the connections between Protestantism and Republicanism, the desire to be able to worship in one's own tradition, and to keep the federal government from having too much say in terms of how each state chooses to worship. The creation of a public faith, as the founders wanted, something that was vague enough to unite all the different traditions and yet affirmed the sovereignty of God. And then the further development of what we would say are American creations in the church, which is denomination construction, a very individual aspect of religion that develops through the evangelical movement. And remember, at this point in time, I'm still talking about low E evangelical. We see how the denominations played out as they discussed race, and how we saw many of these denominations creating theology that supported the institution of slavery and enabled the enslavement of people. So all these trends, so if I were to say, what are the trends, first, there's a fierce desire to be able to worship the way one wants to worship. And one does not want anyone to determine what is the appropriate form of worship. There's a belief that there is a God, and God is sovereign. God is the God of history. And in the American experiment, God has a specific relationship in this grand experiment. We see how theology is used to support political and social beliefs, rightly or wrongly. And we see how race has a tremendous impact on the formation of our churches. One of the reasons why one of the greatest divisions our society has, we describe the most segregated time of American society is 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings, when the white community goes to their churches and the African American community goes to their churches. And we can see how that developed, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that developed today. And then, finally, in the post, Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, we begin to see the mixing of what we would call white nationalism, racial stereotypes, and Christianity into a very toxic mix, and which is something that's still with us today. So, and then we'll dabble on modernism versus fundamentalism, and we'll end there. So we've got a lot to cover this evening. And I think it would be nice if we gathered again next Monday, because I would really like to hear from you all. I really want to hear what your takeaways have been from this conversation. What are things that you noticed? What are things you heard? what are observations you're making about the church, its role in society, and how it's helped form where we are today. What sorts of things have changed? What sorts of things have stayed the same? So I think it would be wonderful if we could wrap up next Monday evening with that kind of discussion. So go ahead and put that on your calendar. Does anybody have any questions before we jump into our Reconstruction era? I know you're all so excited. Like all these young kids with their teachers and just so excited to get started. All right, so we got to sort of the Civil War last session. We talked about the propagation of what I would call a paternalistic theology, a theology that was used by the southern states to support slavery. We talked about the slave Bible, and I know that was of interest. Many of you kind of looked that up on the internet afterwards and checked it out. And I know that there's been a wonderful PBS show that talks about some of the stuff that we've been talking about. And so I would, if you haven't seen it, go to PBS website or check the on-demand listings. You probably want to check that out.
What's it called? What's it called?
Hank, why do you ask me these difficult questions?
Well, Todd, I'm trying to write it down, but how am I going to write it down unless you tell me what it's called?
You write down everything I say?
Yes, right here. Look, here's my.
I can't read that.
I tap it right onto my phone, and I follow up.
Dad, if you
and
have,
then I'm going to ask you questions.
blah 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 blah.
It's called History of the Black Church.
History of the Black Church. Yep.
Is that what it's called? Thank you. Oh, I can't write it down.
It was very
You
good.
better write it down after I had to listen to all that.
All right, I'm going to
Very
go
good.
write it down.
Carve it on your hands. All right, so following the Civil War, what are the major changes that go on in society? Because it's the Civil War, the end of the Civil War through the beginning of the 20th century there was a tremendous change in American society. There were brand new immigration patterns. We see up until the Civil War, the predominant immigration patterns came from English-speaking countries. So we were still seeing predominantly folks from England, Scotland, Ireland, and that begins the shift in just before the Civil War and really picks up after the Civil War. We have a rise in Catholic immigration. As you can imagine, the early Catholic immigration was Irish, but now we're getting more Southern and Eastern European Catholics. In the urban areas, there's great tension between Irish Catholics and Italian Catholics. Philadelphia is a great example of that. The Irish were there first. They took control. They controlled the political machinery in the city of Philadelphia. And it really took until kind of the middle of the 20th century before the Italians assumed greater influence in the city of Philadelphia. So there was always great tension between the new immigrant communities in the States. With this influx, the percentage of Protestants with a British background drops rather tremendously. Statistics have it that from 1860 to 1890, so in a period of 30 years, Protestants with a British background dropped from just under 70% to just over 50%, which, if you think about it, is a pretty significant drop in just a generation's time. So as you think about like the turmoil that's going on, because recall, this is the time period that we also begin to look at the Industrial Revolution. This is the time period that we begin to look at the further urbanization of of the nation. You have more and more people leaving the rural areas, moving into the cities to take advantage of the new jobs that were part of this industrial revolution. You have more and more immigrants coming in to the country. And the people who, for a large part, were the ones calling the shots, the British or the English speaking Protestants, their power is dwindling. Their numbers are dropping. So along with the social changes, there's also tremendous educational changes. Up until the Civil War, most institutions of higher learning were not only church related. So for instance, Princeton, was a Presbyterian related university. Harvard was affiliated with more of the Unitarian tradition. You can go on and on through, if you think of like the top schools, they all had an affiliation with a particular religious tradition. And they were usually led by ministers. And the primary goals of these schools of higher learning were to create a more moral individual. In this case, because of restrictions on what women could study, we're talking about create a more moral man. You needed this moral man, this moral human being, because recall, what we were very concerned about was corruption and sin. And so if you're going to educate people, you want to educate people to care for this nation so that this nation can stay away from sin and corruption. After the Civil War, America begins to adopt more and more of a German style of education, which really talked about developing specialties, of getting more into the nuances of education, of getting into more scientific inquiry, of kind of leaving the broad liberal arts background of the philosophies and humanities and thinking more about specialists, scientists, mathematicians, that sort of thing. Furthermore, businessmen begin to replace the clergy as presidents of colleges. So you no longer have a religious oversight to these schools. Within seminaries themselves, we begin to see a different kind of study. We see more of a historical, critical method of study within the traditions. And it's a good thing we're not all together in a small room because, yes, I have a cold. So even if I sneeze now, you're all protected. You don't have to wear masks. You can thank me for that. And finally, the best example of sort of the changes between academia and church is the rise of Darwinism, or that kind of scientific exploration. So society is changing. The demographics of society are changing. The pressures on society are changing. The educational background of the leaders in that society are changing. The perspective of those leaders is changing. And as you can imagine, it's probably creating quite an upheaval. So before the Civil War gets started, we have a tremendous frenzy of traditions. We didn't talk about this, I may have alluded to it, but there's a region of upstate and western New York, kind of around the Finger Lakes, that's called the Burned Over District. And it's in that area that we saw in sort of like the 1840s or so, the creation of so many different traditions, from the Millerite movement, which attempted to figure out the date of Christ's return, which then led to the Seventh-day Adventist movement. You also have, it's from this area that Joe Smith and Mormonism is created. So this area they talked about, it was all, every year it was coming on fire for a different tradition. And so eventually it got its name as the Burned Over District, because every summer it would be on fire with its new tradition. So you had all this variety of new traditions that develops just before the Civil War. And And I mention that because there will develop a belief in certain people that this sort of religious exploration strayed too far from the tradition. And so some believe that the Civil War was a byproduct of the lack of faith that was found in the United States. And, you know, if people had only stuck to orthodoxy, we would have been okay. All right. So um, when Lincoln is inaugurated the second time, you know, so this is still during the Civil War, he speaks of the need to first seek redemption from God before God can bless this holy experiment. Lincoln is recognizing that things aren't how they're supposed to be. The war is a symptom of that. And before we can sort of ask God for a blessing, we need to redeem ourselves. And that really becomes sort of like the theme of the Reconstruction era. Now it goes in a variety of different ways, as you can imagine. You know, what does redemption mean? Well, we'll talk about it, but in the South, we have the development of the lost cause, and I'll explain that a little bit more. But then in the North, we have the development of something called the social gospel. And so it's this idea that we have to embark upon new means to redeem ourselves from the perceived sins that we've committed. So remember that the founders really understood that God was attentive to history. Yeah, this was not, for most of them, God was not some aloof God. Now, the deists thought that God was aloof, but everybody else thought that God was involved in history. And so God was constantly, not necessarily judging, but God was constantly walking with us. And if we're not faithful to the covenant, we need to make ourselves faithful to the covenant. I don't think they would have admitted this at the time, but the rationale very clearly kind of comes along the lines of what we would say is blessing and curses theology, which none of the churches at the time would have ever adhered to. But it's sort of like, we did something wrong. The Civil War was our punishment for that. Now, you have to decide what the wrong thing was. So in the zeal to redeem America, we have the creation of missionary societies, not only spreading the gospel message in what will become the continental US, but also overseas. We have social movements such as the temperance movement of trying to bring about prohibition. We have the Sunday school movement, which really picks up steam after the Civil War. And then we have rise of organizations like the Salvation Army, which originally is started in England, but then comes to the States, and the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, and then its sister organization, the Young Women's Christian Association. So all these things are coming about because there's a need to redeem America. As you can imagine, the African American church was greatly changed following the Civil War. African Americans, particularly those who had previously been enslaved, now had their own freedom to worship together. And we see the further creation of more national African American churches. You know, by 1895, the National Baptist Convention is founded. We had talked previously about the AME Church, but now we're having more churches along those lines coming together and forming. There's not a tremendous interest in, particularly in the South, of worshiping side by side with the white communities, but it's not like the North was, Shangri-La. The North was just as racist as the South. It may not have believed in slavery, but it certainly did not believe in the equality between white and black. Disabuse yourself of any notion that the North was superior in its racial views at this point in time. So most African Americans begin to worship together in these settings, in these new denominational foundings. And the church really becomes a central focus of the African American community. In many regards, while the white church is losing influence in their own communities, the African American church is gaining far more influence in its own community because it's one of the few networks and social structures that's there to care for the African American community, that the African American community can count on. So as you can imagine, with all the stuff that's going on in terms of the turmoil and social changes, the turmoil in education, the destruction of the Civil War, there's grave concern about the loss of traditional family and community values. Does that sound familiar? This stirs up religious and political concerns. We see the development of the Know Nothing Party, which was vehemently anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. Many were very concerned about the educational changes, not just because it was a threat to the perceived faith, but also because they saw it as a European threat. These new ideas were coming from Europe. People fled Europe to come to the United States because they didn't like European ideals. So all of a sudden, you have these European ideas coming. Anything outside of the continental US was not seen as a good thing. So when we talk about these educational changes and people who are looking at them, if you're so ingrained in American culture and belief in the US as being this special social experiment of God, and then you hear of these European traditions that are coming, whether it's educationally or socially, and it's sort of pulling apart the religious fabric of the tradition, there's a grave pushback against this understanding, which is why the Know Nothing Party comes into existence. You know, there's an external threat coming to America, and we cannot allow that threat to come. And so we have to get rid of Catholics and immigrants. If you get rid of the immigrants, the Catholics won't come because that's the primary cause of immigration at the time. You're getting mostly Catholic immigrants. So within the country, we begin, as I mentioned earlier, we begin to see the development of the lost cause narrative in the South, whereas the North, it's more of a modernist look towards something that we would call the social gospel. The social gospel was a belief that in order to change society for the better, one needs to control society. Okay, one needs to use the values of our faith to kind of determine if you should be able to drink, if you should go to school, eventually if women should be allowed to vote. All those things come out of like the social gospel movement, and a lot of them started in this burned over district back in 1840. You know, the women's suffrage movement starts in Seneca Falls, upstate New York, in the same area. The more traditionalists, as opposed to this modernist social gospel view, more traditionalists believe that the only way to change society is through individual conversion. So the only way we fix society is if I convert Joyce to a much better faith. Okay, so that is very similar to the sort of differences that we see on the left and the right even to today.
Yeah, indeed.
Where you have the belief on the left that in order to change society, we have to change the system. Where on the right, in order to change society, we have to change the individual. So these trends tend to stay the same. They may develop different names, they may develop like different particular issues that they're fighting about, but the issue, the overall direction still remains the same. So what's the lost cause? I'm going to let you ponder that while I build. All right, so the lost cause. A false narrative develops. This is predominantly in the South. And the Lost Cause narrative goes like this. The South had just wanted to be left alone all along. All they wanted to do, and I'm glad Margaret's not on. Margaret, you're not on, right? Because I said alls twice. All that they wanted to do was to be left alone and be able to pursue the idyllic life that they had. And if it wasn't for those pesky, godless Northerners who were violent and aggressive, we would have been allowed to live peacefully. They believed that the war was a punishment from God, not because of slavery, but because of their lack of faith. This becomes the rallying cry for the whole pushback on the Reconstruction era policies. This becomes the pushback that leads to the Jim Crow. We didn't do anything wrong. We were living a proper lifestyle. It was the violent aggression of the North. You know, remember the War of Northern Aggression is, you know, how they would describe the Civil War. You know, this is the Lost Cause principle. The Ku Klux Klan is first founded in 1871. In 1877, and this has relevance for what we just saw, you know, a couple of months ago in DC. In 1877, there was a highly contentious election where the Southern Democrats only accepted Rutherford B. Hayes' election as being legitimate if he ended Reconstruction. So it was a split election, like the claim that was made in this election, even though, you know, that it really wasn't the case. But in 1877, it was split, and they had to cut a deal. They cut the deal. But by cutting the deal, by Rutherford B. Hayes becoming president and ending Reconstruction, we have the beginning of the Jim Crow era. We have a group within the Southern Church who espouse the Lost Cause that they call themselves the Redeemers. The Redeemers were white men who sought to reestablish their ascendant position in society. They're trying to redeem society, but in order to redeem society, the white male must be in a position of power and influence. There can be no other just society without the white male in charge. We see within the KKK movement, as well as these other movements, you know, the Redeemer movements, we see that toxic mix of Christianity, nationalism, and white supremacy. It hasn't gone away. It's changed what it looks like. The groups have changed their names. It's still the same toxic theology. Now, the KKK disappears for a while, but then in the 20th century, it comes back. It's given new life by a Southern Baptist preacher, but it's actually stronger and has more influence in the North than the South. The KKK is not just an entity of the South. Okay, it spans the country, and it has significant influence in the North as well as the South. We also see the heinous, barbaric activity, or I don't even know what to call it, but lynching becomes not only a means of social control, but a grotesque form of entertainment. There are stories and stories and stories of people attending, say, an Easter service, dressed to the nines, having a picnic lunch, and going out and celebrating with a lynching. Grotesque and despicable. So when we talk, you know, this was a question that was asked last time. When we talk about sort of the modern evangelical movement, it really doesn't begin until the 20th century. It's really sort of like a 1920s sort of thing, but the seeds are planted during this time frame. Recall that there's always a response. Whenever there's like a modern movement, there's always a response away from that movement. Much like you can look at today, there's, globalism is like the modern form of economic growth. What's the response? Well, the response is sort of, nations protecting their own. Okay, so there's always a response to a modern movement. The response to the modernist understanding of church was what we would call the fundamentalist movement. Now, remember, when we talk about the modernist approach, we have new ways of studying literature. We have new ways of studying scripture. We're no longer just accepting, the writings of scripture based upon, the idea that this is what was said years ago and is relevant now. Now we're going to figure out, okay, what was the meaning for that original community that these texts were written for? That's what it means when we talk about the historical critical study. We want to figure out what it meant for that original community so that we have a better idea what it means for us now. So the response to this sort of study is to go back the other way, which is just to take things literally. And literalism will develop as one of the main tenets of the modern evangelical movement. And the seeds to this movement are planted in the 18th century. The fundamentalist movement sees this idea that God is active in the present world and is speaking to us through the present sciences and present things. They view that as error. Now, interestingly enough, these are the same people in the same tradition that always spoke of God being present in this American experiment and speaking differently than God had spoken, say, during European history. But now, all of a sudden, because they're concerned about these modernist tendencies, they're beginning to say, oh, wait, maybe we were taking things too far. And so they don't want to see God as being active in the modern understanding of what's happening. They believe that reading scripture and trying to figure out what it means for us today is a form of heresy. If God said this, that's what it meant. You don't need to figure out what it means for us today. You don't even need to figure out what it meant for when he originally said it. This is what God said, that's it. So how does that realistically change the understanding? So, I put this up here as Princeton Theological Seminary had always been an interesting mix of conservative and progressive, more, we talk about old light, new light kind of dynamic. But it was seen as so far within the modernist worldview that one of the professors from Princeton leaves, founds Westminster Theological Seminary here in the Philadelphia area to be a fundamentalist response to what's happening at Princeton. Okay, so this is the later parts of the 19th century that this is happening. And we see this occurring in a lot of seminaries and a lot of theological schools as people begin to divvy up whether they're going to be a modernist or fundamentalist. But fundamentalism hasn't quite started yet. We're just beginning to kind of plant those seeds. The other issue, or the other theology that begins to develop that helps plant the seeds for the modern evangelical movement is the rise of dispensationalism. John Nelson Darby is an Anglican minister in the Church of Ireland. Don't get confused. That just means the Anglican Church that was the official Church of Ireland because of the British influence in Ireland. But it's the same as being in the Church of England. He begins to see that the promises that God had made to Israel were not fulfilled in Israel's lifetime. And he would say that there were certain dispenses, time periods, that occurred where a covenant was formed, the people failed, God creates a new covenant. So when he's viewing things, he believes that all those promises that God makes to the Old Testament in the Jewish scriptures, those will still come true, but they will come true in our time. And so he becomes a premillennial dispensationalist, which is a long way of saying before Christ returns, we're going to put all this straight. Things like Revelations will occur actually as is written because things haven't come true yet. And since things haven't come true yet, that means the book of Revelations actually has to be the actual events that occur. Now, in our Bible study, I've always said that dispensationalism and the way that a lot of people believe the book of Revelation is read, I've always said it's a very modern understanding. And this is what I mean by that. John Nelson Darby writes this theory in 1880. But it's not until 1909 with the creation of the Scofield Bible and the Scofield Bible series that this sort of theology is put out to the masses. So it's only been around for 100 years. And we primarily see it when we think of things like the rapture and, the book of Revelation coming true literally. Up until that point in time, nobody had talked about rapture. Nobody had talked about the book of Revelations happening literally. And now, if you ask most Christians, they would tell you, oh, that's how it's supposed to be. When that's not what people have said throughout history. So eventually, we have a merging of sort of this dispensationalist thought and fundamentalism that joins together, and we have the beginning of the evangelical movement, the modern evangelical movement, which begins 1920-ish. Okay? All right.
So Todd, would the Scopes Monkey Child 1925 be an example of that gaining purchase and all that? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that's the epitome when we talk about the development of the fundamentalist movement. That trial, and the work of who were the two lawyers?
William Jennings Bryan and
Right, and Darrow.
Clarence Darrow.
Yeah. That whole trial really set the dynamic between the modernist understanding of faith and the fundamentalist understanding of faith. And it really hasn't changed much. I mean, it varies here or there, but really the line that was drawn back then is very similar to the line that we'll see today. All right, thoughts? Because that's all I got.
Do you comment on the Scofield Bible a little bit?
Yeah, in what way? Do you have a particular?
What makes it different?
Well, it's just a very fundamentalist and traditional view of scripture reading. That was because it has influence from dispensationalism. It's just different. So it's going to talk more about what's going to happen in the very near future. The promises that we sort of talk about when we read scripture and think about the commentary are always like, well, God was faithful to Israel then, and God will be faithful to us. When you get to the Scofield, the interpretation is more of God is leading us this way. Because God said this back then, that means right now, if we don't do this, we're going to get destroyed. So the interpretation and commentary is far more about what's going to happen right now.
So Todd, it's the commentary then that makes that Bible a Scofield.
Well, the author
They
was
don't
Scofield.
edit. They're not editing parts in and out of the Bible, are they? Or did they?
No, it's not the equivalent of the slave Bible.
Okay.
It's more of they just completely reinterpret
Okay.
scripture based upon a fundamentalist dispensationalist view.
So one could buy a Scofield
Oh
Bible.
yeah,
have
yeah.
all the
It's still very popular.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, and you know these, you know, you can go to many of the different web-based Bible study sites, and a lot of them are still based around Schofield and Darby.
Mhm.
Was he an editor?
He was the author.
Oh, he was the author that did the commentary and so forth.
Yeah.
Huh. A minister, I presume, or not?
Depends how you want to define minister.
Or he thought he was a minister. Yeah.
I'll be generous and say he was a minister.
Okay.
But what exactly is the Schofield Bible?
It's a Bible.
I mean, did he change the words?
Yeah, sure. He changes the words to fit his interpretation of the scripture. It's the equivalent if you have an NRSV Bible. That's a study Bible, right? For those of you who, you know, when you do Bible study, you have the NRSV and then it has study helps along the way.
Mhm.
The Schofield is the same way, but it's just written from this particular
Mhm.
perspective.
So in other words, at the bottom, where the study things are, he puts his own interpretation and he doesn't change the passages, does he?
No, no. No, I mean, he may change some of the wording, like in the NRSV. So when we, you know, come to that passage in Isaiah where it talks about, and then this young woman will give birth, I'll guarantee you in his, it says virgin. Even though most of us realize that as that's an error of interpretation and translation, it should say young lady. But in Schofield, it's going to say virgin. But there's greater things. So when it comes to like the passage where it talks about, I think it's in Matthew, where there will be two workers in the fields, and one will be taken and one will be left behind, he will say, probably in his notes and in his commentary, this is the rapture.
Mm.
Most other Bibles do not say that because the rapture is not something that the church has ever taught, nor necessarily believed in.
How does this, are you there?
Now I'm here.
How does this impact mainline denominations? I mean, I'm thinking of Billy Sunday and then, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century, I guess, and then thinking a little bit about Billy Graham, you know, post-war. So how does this movement, is it just a little ripple to them? Can you, did it have a major significance to mainline denominations or even the Black church?
So in terms of the mainline denominations, most of them skewed closer to modernist tendencies. And at this time, it was called liberal Protestantism, with the belief that progress is going to lead us to a better day and that the kingdom will come because we're going to progress naturally there. That's liberal Protestantism up until World War I. World War I, and with all the bloodshed that occurs, destroys liberal Protestantism. Okay. And one of the reasons why we sort of look at 1920s as a time when we have the modern and fundamentalist movement is in response to World War I.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
You know, the fundamentalist movement was like, see, you all were wrong.
Yeah.
You know, your liberal Protestantism led us to believe that we could create the kingdom of heaven. The fundamentalists said you were in error because you stopped reading the Bible strictly, literally.
Huh.
Okay. So what happens in the liberal church? Well, it flounders for a little bit until we have the development of the neo-Orthodox movement, which is really a 1930s, 20s and 30s development, when you have people like Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others who kind of go back to a more Orthodox view of things, re-elevate the issue of sin and what that means in humanity. And then based around that, you have the mainline tradition sort of within both the liberal and conservative bent, but staying closer to the modernist interpretation as opposed to the fundamentalist movement. The fundamentalist modern evangelical movements primarily focus on things like the Southern Baptist Convention, as well as your independent churches, your Pentecostal traditions. We didn't even get into the development of Pentecostal traditions, and that's a whole nother bailiwick. So from this point in time, we begin to see a split, whereas most of the churches became a split between like North-South pre-Civil War, and then they might have come back together afterwards. But after the Civil War, it's not North-South, it becomes more modernist fundamentalist splits. That eventually by 1920, the rift has gone so far that they're two completely different traditions.
Where does the Black church fit into this?
In what way?
Well, this modernist fundamentalist, are they going their own way?
Do you want to help me with that, Carolyn?
Well, I think, Pastor Tom, when we think about, Richard Allen's walkout, 1787, we fast forward to, 1895 with the founding of the National Baptist Convention, which in and of itself begins to split off, right? There's all these splinter movements that start. I was going to put in the chat, I recall, you think about these devastating parts of history. So think about the war, thinking about like Great Depression, right? And where does this lead people in looking for faith practice and looking for where we're going to get our help from, right? So you have the mainline denominations, so Methodists, AMEs, the Baptists, but then you also get the movements of Father Divine, the movements of Daddy Grace, the movements of Jehovah Witness, which in my family, I know that saved literally my grandmother's brother. I mean, that literally, and he ended up like being like a Jehovah Witness preacher. And so, and this fire and brimstone preaching, you've got to get back to God. And how do you balance this social gospel aspect, which the Black church really, think about Richard Allen, he walks out, he doesn't go to he doesn't find a church. He hasn't found the AME church. He founds the Free African Society, right? A mutual aid, him and Absalom Jones. So it was about social agency, right? Then comes the church piece. So it's this continuing like social gospel always being a critical part, but also, wait, we're doing all this good, but where is the status of our hearts? So how are we reading the text? Is God mad at us? And so is this, we're out and doing all this social good, but where are our hearts? So reading the text and I would say to this day, there is very much still a fundamental read of the Holy Writ. And so that's when we talk about, as much as Black institutions want to state that they're liberal, when we really hit some of those key kind of topics, they're very fundamental. But then knew how to subvert the message, because saying, oh, well, there's no way that God would say we're called to be slaves. That's not what that text meant. But we bring up homosexuality or some other things. Wait, we're going with the text. But that is abomination, right? And so so within the movement, but then there's these offskirts that start to take, and they start to this whole like utopia. Father Divine, that would be a really cool topic. And he's he's local really to the mainline, Gladwin. Daddy Grace. And then here we are many moons later, where they would be some of the largest landowners when it comes to African-American denominations in the country. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of those, the Father Divine and many of the other sort of like storefront movements that develop kind of our 20th century. And, from an outside looking in, again, it's sort of, if you're a white person in America, even post-Civil War, you still have the luxury of thinking about all this cuckoo nonsense.
Mm.
In other words, you can decide whether you should be a literalist or metaphorical, right? If you're part of the African American community, post 1877, the development of Jim Crow laws, the fact that the KKK begins to spread north and south, do you really have a lot of time to dabble into some of these theological, complexities? It's almost as if, white privilege is what grants us the ability to create, fundamentalism or the modernist movement. There's a, it's far, I would assume that the African American churches post Civil War were far more concerned with how do we make sure that we get the land that we're supposed to be getting from the government, and how are we going to make sure that we are safe, and how do we stay connected as people, how do we take care of our children, more so than some of the other theological debates that you find in like the mainline denominations.
And being, I guess, and to the point of just is being self-sufficient. So that spirit of self-help,
Right.
determination. So even if we look at like some of the HBCUs, many of them start in churches,
Right.
literally like in basements. Right? We think of Morehouse, Spelman, Wilberforce, or they're tied to, I think, similar model of being tied to a denomination, given the support, and also that would be a pipeline of how to, get students in, right? But that being an all-around epicenter.
One of the things that I was struck of as a boy growing up, whose dad was an Episcopalian minister, I remember my dad watching Billy Graham on television, the Crusades and all that he would have, and I can't help but think. Now, I'm thinking that Graham is a combining of this fundamentalist evangelical piece, and certainly the rise of television gives that whole that whole branch, or that whole way of looking at religion, purchase. It gives them a place where they can be heard, and I would think that, and I just know from my personal experience of my father looking at this stuff, and it didn't feel anywhere like the Episcopalian church that I grew up in, But I'm thinking about the mass market that might have occurred because of that.
Well, I mean, in a certain regard, like the radio and the TV helps replace the revival camps.
Mm.
But you still have massive gatherings that are taking place,
Mhm.
and it's all about, well, I'm not going to say it's, emotion plays a huge part in the evangelical and fundamentalist movement, particularly during its heyday. The idea, and this goes way back to the first revivalist movements, the idea is you take somebody to the brink of the end of the world. Why was the conversation about the book of Revelations so powerful in the fundamentalist movement? Because that's going to happen. So when the plagues come, what are you going to do? Are you going to make yourself right? If you're going to make yourself right when the plagues come, do it now. Why wait? So that's the approach that, when we talk about the revival meetings of the 19th century and then into the fundamentalist evangelical movement, that's what happens. Your job is to take people to Judgment Day and say, if you're going to give yourself to Christ on Judgment Day, don't wait. Do it right now. Save yourself right now. And then you're, everything's fine. That's when we begin to get the terms like born again.
Mm-hmm.
So it's at that moment when you recommit yourself to Christ, you are born again. And if you have thousands of people around you, screaming out, I accept Christ as my Lord, you get swept up in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's almost like Leap of Faith. A current, I've ever seen the Steve Martin movie.
Right.
But that's kind of that. And then to think about that you have people also doing both. So they're doing their mainline traditional worship and then also dibbing and dabbing, if you will, in these commercialized kind of movements that push the gospel into these mediums. And think about the money. I mean, it's capitalism in some regards at its best too. So how do you compete with that? You know?
Yeah. I mean, in my previous church in Williamstown, they, you know, as I'm looking through the minutes, they would pay monthly. Revivalist preacher would come through, and they would pay monthly for him to come through. Dude made a fortune just off of Williamstown. But yeah, that's, you know, it's a Presbyterian church, PCUSA. It always has been, but it was having revivalist camp meetings on a monthly basis during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And they had Sunday school classes of 300 men.
You know what? You've made me think about this a little bit, and it might be because I'm doing this work for my adult education with Bonhoeffer. But you talked about the incredible disillusionment that came out of World War I, and kind of a crisis of faith, you know, that came out of that. And then I'm thinking about what happened post World War II, and seeing this exponential growth in mainline denominations in the 50s. And I'm trying to figure out, well, you know, why wouldn't there be that disillusionment after World War II, looking at the Holocaust and all that stuff? It makes me want to find out a little bit more about what the difference was.
I don't think there's disillusionment.
No,
You're misreading it, and I say that respectfully.
yeah,
I think what happens is you have the wars, including the Civil War, is a great corrective. In other words, it's a shock to the system. And how do we, if we viewed ourselves as a religious society, you know, say you're American, and after the Civil War, you're seeing all that horrific bloodshed and destruction. And if leading up to this time, you thought that we were the shining city on the hill, how could this happen? So that's why we have this, you know, with Lincoln, we have this talk about redemption, you know, and how do we redeem this society? And that, I think that happened after the Civil War. I think it happens after World War I, and I think it happens after World War II. You know, and I think there's, I don't necessarily, I mean, from the height of the colonialist period, when you have, you know, the Puritans settling in the Plymouth colony, that's the height of Christendom in America. It's sort of downhill from there. Okay, I mean, the reason why we need these great awakenings, you know, and these further awakenings, is because people are falling away from the church every day. You know, so you know, we keep having to have this renewal, this emphasis of renewal. That's why we have to have like these social gospel movements, right? It's because the church is losing influence. People aren't going to church anymore. It's the same struggle over and over again. And there's blips of when things go up, and then there's deeper troughs, and then there's a blip where things come up a little bit, and then it's a deeper trough. But the overall, like, you know, we have like the 7-day trends and the COVID, the overwhelming trend is down. Overwhelmingly from the Plymouth colony to today. You know, and I think there's this false sense that the church in the United States has always been like, you know, 99% of America attends church. No, it's besides the Plymouth colony, when they would throw you in stocks if you didn't go to church. It's never been like that, you know. And so I don't necessarily, I wouldn't call it disillusionment, but every single time like there's a shock to the system, how many times do you go back to the same old? In other words, wait a minute, we tried being more faithful afterwards and there was another shock to the system, so maybe it's not faith. You know, we were religious and Civil War happened. Okay, so we tried again. We were religious and then World War I happened. Okay, we tried this new thing. We were religious and then World War II happened. Okay, we were religious and then the Korean War. Oh, and then the Vietnam War, and we're really wondering. I mean, are we really Christians? We keep killing all these people. So eventually we keep circling back and going, well, are we Christian or not? And if we are, is this the kind of people we really want to be? Is Christianity all that it's cracked up to be?
You're not going to leave us with that.
That's it.
Well, you know, if nothing else, let's dispel this notion that at one point in time, all American settlers and residents could walk on water. Okay, there would be mass drownings. Okay. We've always struggled. We're always trying to make sense of the world. How do we make sense of the world based upon our faith? That's what the struggle has always been.
The other thing I've read a little bit is about this guy, Harry Emerson Fosdick, as a guy that kind of bridged a little bit of this, fundamentalist, modernist. How does he fit in? How do you see him fitting in?
Well, you have people like Fosdick and Horace Bushnell, I believe, who, yeah, they did sort of straddle that, but they were also like, in some regards, they were the Karl Barth of their day.
Uh-huh.
So they could talk in the language of fundamentalists, but do it in a way that, adapted more modern sensibilities. But that's what a lot of the educators were doing at the time. They understood that, faith is serious and real and biblical study is serious and real, but it's evolving. And how, if we as human beings are constantly evolving, if our understanding of God is constantly evolving, and the great thing about the historical critical understanding is that we actually see one of two things happens in Scripture. We either have to say that the people writing about God are evolving or that God is evolving. One of those two things is happening within Scripture. Right? Because we go from, if the earliest writings about God tend to be the I'm going to destroy all of you to I'm going to love you until the end of days. Somewhere along the lines, there's been a shift. Was it God that shifted? Was it our understanding of God that shifted? One or the other shifted. And so the modernist understanding is recognizing these shifts and recognizing what that means for us today. Because a fundamentalist can't make sense of those shifts that are taking place. Because we know, for instance, that most of the scriptures weren't, in terms of the Old Testament, weren't written until after the exile. So you can't really talk about what Abraham was doing because we don't even know if there was a dude named Abraham. Right? And I can't remember. Oh, I think Nancy shared this with me. But modern biblical archaeology is saying that there was no Exodus. That the Israelites were actually a group of outsiders within the Canaanite society that eventually, during a grave kind of discord that took place when Egypt begins to withdraw from the area, they become empowered. They create their own society because they've always been on the outskirts. And that's the beginning of what we would call Israel. And that's a Jewish and Christian understanding. I'm not saying, this is what Christians are saying. I mean, that's a Christian and Jewish understanding. So all these things are, we're always evolving with our understanding. And the struggle that is seen, from the beginning of the founding of the country until the end of the Reconstruction era is how do we struggle with how society is changing around us? How does our faith meet those struggles and those challenges? All right, so you have
No, I'm just saying,
one more, and then I got to pick up my dog,
Okay.
otherwise I get in trouble.
I'm just saying, based on what you're saying, it seems like it devolved into two camps. The fundamentalists and the literalists, as opposed to the modernists and kind of the whole idea of interpretation that evolves as a result of the time that you're in.
There's always predominantly two camps in anything. Then you get a varied along the spectrums, right? But there's always like two poles, in these conversations. The last 100 years or so, it's primarily been a conversation between a modernist understanding and a fundamentalist understanding. But there's always two poles. Like in the Presbyterian Church, there was the New Lights and the Old Lights. The New Lights just believed that we needed a new confession. The Old Lights were perfectly happy with the Westminster Confession. There's always two poles. And then you get people in the middle like, I hear you. Maybe it's just a short confession. Or, maybe I can't buy everything being literal, but this, as Carolyn was saying, this section literally makes sense to me. So I'm going to like that one. The rest of it, I'll kind of.
And then to go deeper about being fundamentalist, how can we be truly fundamentalist when we are not engaging the text in its original language?
Right.
I mean, that's so it's
Which
already
is Latin.
right. And Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, right?
No, it's all Latin.
It's all Latin. Okay. So, like to think of the,
Right.
because what we're seeing, it's been distilled, it's been passed through. I mean, it's a
Right.
whole, you talked about Schofield earlier, right? Like,
Right.
so how, I think we have to also look at when you say that, like, really, like, are you really taking into really dealing with the text with all of its integrity, right? With all of the wraparounds that go with it.
And I just want to point out, I had somebody in seminary who he asked us, he was a guest lecturer, and he asked this, okay, how many of you believe that Joseph and Mary journeyed from Nazareth to Bethlehem? And everybody raised their hand. That, conservative, liberal, didn't matter. He goes, you're all biblical fundamentalists.
As far as I'm concerned, it's all Greek to me.
Well, so there's like levels of fundamentalism. Like most of us, based upon that definition, are fundamentalists. So how are you going to define what it is to be a fundamentalist?
Mhm.
All right. You have plenty of food for thought. I will get this lecture up tomorrow on the website. It's already on Facebook. I'll also have the slides up as well. Review stuff. If you have a chance, check out the PBS show. Bring your questions and let's have a conversation next week about what you've heard, what you see, and try and kind of, be a historian. Extrapolate the patterns that you're seeing that sort of were founded earlier, but that we're still seeing today. So, let's see what we come up with. Fair game?
Good.
Hey, looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Good night. Stay safe, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Better.